Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. Today it's Tim, back with you for our journey through the Bible. This year, one chapter at a time, one day at a time. Our reading for today is from Exodus, Exodus chapter 2, 3, and 4. It begins with just a great story. Starts out in the lean-tos and the shanties that were the slaves' quarters in Egypt. And a couple met, fell in love, they were married, and in the process of time, they discovered that they were going to have a child. They were hoping for a girl. I think I'm safe to say that because at that time in history, Pharaoh had made a decree that every boy child that was born must be killed by being thrown in the river. So I would say they were probably hoping it's a girl so she could live, but it was a boy who was born. Wasn't even given a name. At first, it was very unlikely that this boy would ever survive, but he did survive. And yet, how could the parents know what was in store for that child and what kind of a future that he would have, if any? How could they possibly know that hundreds of years later, that the highest religious authorities will be looking back at that little slave baby and proudly declaring, "We are Moses' disciples"? Because it was Moses who's that slave baby. And in the story, um, he becomes the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. Can you imagine what a transition that is from a slave with the death penalty on him to becoming the son of Pharaoh's daughter? Grew up in Pharaoh's household, and his granddad was Pharaoh himself. If they had tabloid newspapers at that time, Moses probably would have been on the front page, and photographers would be stalking him every place that he went. He was trained in all the wisdom and knowledge of Egypt. And of course, we're still learning some of the things that they knew back in Egypt at that time. He had access to the riches that were available to someone who was in Pharaoh's household. And yet there came a time, we don't know exactly when that time was, but he was an adult. He was grown, and he had to make a choice. Was he going to continue his life of luxury and riches, the good life, as part of Pharaoh's household, or was he going to identify with those slaves there in Egypt? And he chose to identify with the slaves. You know, the choices that we make can have a huge impact. And in his case, it had an impact on a whole nation and changed the whole course of history. He had no idea that was going to happen at that time, of course. Now, why would he choose, though, to identify with slaves? Somebody may look at that and say, boy, that was a dumb choice to make when he had access to influence and power and money, part of Pharaoh's household, and he chose to identify as one of the slaves, the Jews that were there in Egypt. Why in the world would Moses want to do that? Well, Hebrews chapter 11 looks back at that experience and it tells us he did it by faith. And for him, it was not a bad deal because he esteemed the reproach of Christ as being more valuable than all the riches of Pharaoh. Now that tells us something, doesn't it? That people who lived in Egypt at that time, the Israelites, they were suffering and they were being misused and they were beaten. And they were slaves. Their children were being killed. And yet Hebrews 11 says that was the reproach of Christ. I think every time a Jewish slave was beaten by the Egyptians, our Lord felt it. These were his people. This was his reproach. It wasn't just the reproach of these Jews who were making bricks in Egypt. That was the reproach of Christ. And I think by faith, Moses understood not all that was about to happen, but he understood that God was a part of this whole process. And he chose to be on God's side because that was more valuable than choosing Pharaoh. And of course, we know how the story would end, that he would lead his people out of Egypt. He'd be the lawgiver. He would give them the 10 Commandments, lead them to the promised land. Uh, we'll get into that story as we go through the book Exodus, but it all starts with a decision that he made to identify with Pharaoh and his family, or to identify with the Jews who were slaves in Egypt. And he chose to be on God's side. You know, in our lives, we make many choices that are similar, and probably like Moses, we have no idea what the consequences may be of choosing to be on God's side and do things His way. But I tell you one thing: the reproach of Christ is greater riches than anything else this world has to offer. When you have a choice in your life that you need to make, don't follow your heart. Don't follow the logic of your own mind. Follow Christ and his path for your life. That's what we can learn from Moses and the decision that he made there in chapter 2. Well, choose wisely, my friends. Think about that, and I look forward to being back with you again tomorrow. Our reading for tomorrow is in Exodus 5, 6, and 7. Read that, and then we'll think about it for a few minutes then. All right? See you then.